There is a small izakaya in Fukuoka where most evenings a group of coworkers gathers after work, phones face down and untouched on the table for the entire meal, not because anyone announced a rule, but because reaching for a phone mid-meal simply isn't something that occurs to anyone in the room. Meanwhile, somewhere else right now, a family is sitting around a dinner table, phones lit up beside every plate, someone glancing down mid-sentence, a conversation trailing off because no one quite noticed it had stopped. Same basic setting, food, people, a shared table, completely different relationship to the meal itself. What if the difference between a dinner that feels connected and one that feels fragmented has almost nothing to do with willpower or phone addiction, and almost everything to do with 7 quiet habits that shape what a meal is actually for? By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what those 7 habits are and why they can make putting your phone away at dinner feel automatic rather than like a rule you're forcing yourself to follow. Before we walk through the habits themselves, we need to address an assumption most people carry into the phone at dinner problem. The assumption is this: the solution is discipline, a rule enforced through willpower, a phone basket by the door, a self-imposed band checked by guilt when broken. This sounds reasonable, but it treats the symptom rather than the cause. Because the phone isn't pulling attention away from a compelling meal, it's filling a gap left by a meal that was never structured to hold attention in the first place. The actual shift isn't fighting the pull of the phone. It's making the meal itself the more interesting thing in the room. This is the piece almost every digital detox guide quietly skips. The real Japanese term, Itadakimasu, said before eating, an acknowledgement of the food, the people who prepared it, and the life that was given to sustain the eater, spoken with a brief pause before the first bite. The practice: the meal has a clear, marked beginning, a shared moment where everyone's attention converges on the same point at the same time, rather than people trickling into eating individually and asynchronously, while distracted by other things. The scientific validation. Research on group attention and ritual has found that synchronized opening moments, even brief ones, measurably increase sustained joint attention for the duration of an activity that follows, because a shared starting cue creates a psychological frame that the whole group implicitly agrees to stay inside of. The second habit concerns the physical arrangement of the meal itself. The real Japanese term, ichiju sansai, 1 soup, 3 dishes. The traditional structure of small, separate dishes rather than a single large plate. The practice: because the meal consists of several small dishes rather than 1 plate, eating naturally involves more physical engagement, reaching, selecting, combining, rather than the passive, repetitive motion of a single fork moving to a single plate, which leaves the hands and attention more occupied throughout. The scientific validation. Research on embodied attention has found that tasks requiring more varied physical engagement produce measurably lower rates of secondary device use than passive, repetitive tasks, because idle hands and idle attention are what typically reach for a phone. The third habit is about the deliberate pace of the meal. The real Japanese term, hara hachibu, eating until 80% full, a practice that naturally extends the duration of a meal since it requires slower eating and more attention to internal signals rather than external distraction. The practice: meals are eaten slowly enough that finishing isn't the primary goal, which removes the waiting period at the end of a meal, the boredom gap after food is gone but before people are ready to leave, which is often exactly when phones emerge. The scientific validation. Behavioral studies on device use during meals have found that phone checking occurs disproportionately during lulls, specifically after eating has finished, but before a meal is socially considered over, meaning a naturally slower meal structurally removes the exact window where phone use tends to begin. The fourth habit involves the specific practice of pouring for others rather than oneself. The real Japanese term, oshaku, the custom of pouring a drink for someone else at the table rather than refilling one's own glass. The practice. Throughout the meal, small acts of attending to another person's glass or plate happen naturally and repeatedly, which requires noticing someone else, their glass, their needs, dozens of times over the course of a meal. The scientific validation. Research on prosocial attention has found that small, repeated acts of noticing another person's needs measurably increase feelings of connectedness and reduce self-focused attention, the same self-focused attention that typically precedes reaching for a phone. The fifth habit concerns how conversation itself is structured. The real Japanese term, aizuchi, the small verbal and physical acknowledgments, nods, brief responses given continuously while someone else speaks. The practice. Listening is treated as an active, visible behavior rather than a passive state, meaning attention has to be continuously signaled rather than simply assumed, which makes a wandering attention span immediately noticeable to the listener themselves as much as to the speaker. The scientific validation. Research on conversational engagement has found that active listening behaviors create a feedback loop that keeps the listener's own attention anchored because the physical act of nodding and responding requires ongoing awareness of what's being said, unlike passive listening, which can drift without the listener noticing. The sixth habit is about the shared, communal nature of certain dishes. The real Japanese term, torizara, the small individual plate used to serve oneself from a larger shared dish at the center of the table. The practice. Certain dishes are placed centrally and shared, requiring brief coordination, waiting a turn, noticing when someone else is reaching, which creates small moments of interpersonal awareness that a plate of food already portioned onto an individual plate simply doesn't require. The scientific validation. Research on commensality, the practice of eating together, has found that shared dishes requiring coordination produce measurably higher reported feelings of social bonding than meals where every portion is pre-divided and independent, because coordination itself is a form of ongoing social engagement. The seventh and final habit is the simplest, and it happens at the very end of the meal. The real Japanese term, gochiso-sama, said after eating, an expression of gratitude that formally closes the meal, spoken together rather than trailing off individually. The practice. The meal has a clear, marked ending, just as it has a clear beginning, a shared verbal moment that signals the activity is genuinely complete, rather than an ambiguous tapering off where some people are still eating while others have already mentally moved on to their phones. The scientific validation. Research on activity closure has found that clearly marked endings reduce the ambiguous transitional period, during which attention typically fragments, because an unclear ending leaves people uncertain whether they're still in the activity or free to disengage. And phones fill exactly that uncertainty. As you've seen, putting your phone away at dinner has very little to do with willpower and everything to do with 7 quiet habits that shape what the meal itself is doing. Mark a clear beginning through Itadakimasu. Structure the meal for physical engagement through ichiju sansai. Slow the pace through hara hachi. Attend to others through oshaku. Signal active, listening through aizuchi. Coordinate around shared dishes through torizara, and mark a clear ending through gochiso-sama. None of it requires banning the phone or fighting the urge to check it. It requires building a meal interesting and structured enough that the urge simply doesn't arise. If this changed the way you think about your next dinner, please like this video and subscribe so we can continue unlocking this kind of practical Japanese wisdom together. Now, I want to hear from you. Which of these 7 habits are you going to try at your next meal? Leave it in the comments below. Until the next video.